Hello team, welcome to another ATP Geopolitics video with myself, Jonathan MSP. This is Ukraine War News Update, second part thereof for the 4th of November 2024. We're going to have a military aid and geopolitics section in the same video here. We're going to start with the same old rumbling on of the issue concerning deep strikes into Russia. And we have, the reason I'm bringing this up again, because I was talking about this in the first video today as to what's going on. Because I'm under the impression that the British and French are fine with strikes deep into Russia and it's being held up by the Americans. And other people saying, no, you know, you're blaming Keir Starmer or blaming Olaf Scholz, even blaming Emmanuel Macron. I think the French are pretty much in the clear on this. But it's interesting that the Sun, British tabloid, has come out with a newspaper article saying Estonia backs the British calls to let Ukraine blitz Russia with long-range missiles to force Putin to negotiate. So this is the Sun, and this talks about Estonia, what we should not have restrictions on Ukraine using weapons. Estonia's prime minister saying that, but it talks about Trump claimed he could end the war in a day. Ukraine fears a Donald Trump victory in tomorrow's US election would see Kiev's troops thrown to the wolves. Interesting that the Sun is stating that. And it then goes on to say that America has blocked Ukraine's demands to fire British Storm Shadow stealth cruise missiles at targets inside Russia. The White House also rejected calls to give Ukraine Tomahawk land attack missiles. So this in this article, we have the idea that it's the Americans that are putting a stop to the British missiles being used as the Ukrainians would like. So I just thought that's interesting. Okay, it's the Sun, but I'm trying to work out exactly what's going on there. EU's Joseph Borrell, asks South Korea to set up aid to Ukraine. So Russia's aggression, quote, against Ukraine is an existential threat. The Republic of Korea is best positioned to understand it, Joseph Borrell said after a meeting with the South Korean defense minister. So hopefully the EU's put some pressure on the South Koreans there to help Ukraine in a much more explicit manner. Now, Colby Badwire here says aid to Ukraine really is an investment in American manufacturing. So $51.2 billion has gone into the US defense industrial base to date. Once all funds are obligated, it will be over $60 billion. Top recipients are Arkansas, $4.25 billion, Alabama, 3.31, Pennsylvania, 2.83, Arizona, 2.72, Texas, 2.04, West Virginia, 1.98, California, 1.98, Florida, 1.59, Missouri, 968 million, New York, 943 million. A lot of those are red states, like Republican states that are not, at least according to some of the Republican leaders, the Republicans are not so keen on aid packages going to Ukraine. Of course, it depends who you talk to, whether it's that kind of top MAGA echelon, or actually it's the sensible ones a bit further down, your Mike Turners and people in the Senate who are much more realistic in what aid to Ukraine does and why it is given. Note that not all contracts and investments are reflected on the map. So here's the map he's talking about. It won't match the total obligations, but it's kind of useful infographic, isn't it? Only prime contractors and select key subcontractors are mapped. The defense industrial supply chain stretches into all 50 states, and many states are underrepresented due to the nature of the weapon systems provided to Ukraine, e.g. no aircraft, very little for South Carolina and Washington. If your state isn't highlighted, that doesn't mean that there are no funds from the Ukraine supplementals flowing into your state. That point's really important, that while contracts might go to concerns in that state, you have the supply chains that can stretch right across the US. And so that money goes down, and then you get money multiplied. So it's not just the supply chain or the direct supply chain in terms of components. So you might have, a HIMARS missile gets made by Lockheed Martin here, and then it uses these components, those components, those components. And then you think, okay, those components manufactured in that state, and that state. So actually the supply chain stretches that far. But actually, we can be even more nuanced and say, well, that money is going into these different plants then, and right down the supply chain. They are now having to employ more people. Those people are then putting extra money into the local communities. So you could say that money then multiplies out in local communities where these people are working, where they otherwise wouldn't have had jobs. And so therefore that investment is increasing the amount of money these states are getting. And it's not just the direct funding, but the money multiplies. So like $100, if I give $100 to anyone, just a human being, that money, if it's spent, multiplies out. So that $100, right, you go to the shop, you buy that kind of thing, then you go to the pub, you buy that, and then you go to there, you buy that, and you go to here, you buy that. So that $100 gets spent in all these different places, and a florist for your missus, right? But then the florist has another $20, and they go and spend that on supplies, that $20. And so all of that money multiplies. $100 becomes thousands of dollars, essentially, in how many times that gets spent in the local community. And that's what I talk about when I talk about money multiplier. $100 isn't just $100, or $1,000 isn't just $1,000, or $1 billion isn't just $1 billion. That will get spent and then spent and then spent again and spent again, and it multiplies and it stimulates. And that's why we talk about, you've got two options during a recession, which is one, borrow more and whack that into the economy and stimulate the economy so people start working more, have more money, spending more money, or you cut costs and do austerity, but that's not a stimulus. And there are those two kind of approaches, all somewhere in the middle. But the idea that if you do have a stimulus, that you spend $1 billion of taxpayers' money into the economy, that swirls around, generating more than $1 billion. It's worth more than $1 billion because it gets spent and then spent and then spent and then spent. And, anyway, you get the point. Right. Okay, artillery supplies from partners for Ukraine have increased, says Zelensky. So there have been these claims from some of the top people that Ukraine have narrowed the gap of artillery fire rates from 1 to 7 to 1 to 2. Now, that might not be, as Thierry says often in the threads, that actually people on the front line don't necessarily agree. They might feel it is not 1 to 2, but then it's dependent on where you're talking about. So some areas it might be 1 to 1, other areas might be 1 to 4, and you might feel that, hey, in my area it sucks and we need more artillery ammunition. But the main point is that the Czech initiative has produced coming up for 1 million rounds that Ukraine weren't going to get. Plus, there's a ramping up of all of the manufacturing across Europe, in the States, in the UK, in Australia, and then you've got South Korea maybe backfilling, etc., etc. So there are all these ways that there's just simply more ammunition getting into Ukraine, and that is beyond a shadow of a doubt. There is more now than they had, say, 7 months ago. So Ukraine has been receiving increasingly more military assistance from international partners, namely artillery shells, said Zelensky today. Interceptions of Russian drones with the help of a net launcher installed on a Ukrainian drone. I talked about this only yesterday, that the Russians appear to have an advantage. We've seen a number of videos of the Russians using these net launchers against Ukrainian drones and having some pretty good success. Well, now we have a video almost like, well, you can do that, we can do that too. And actually, when it comes to something low tech like that, that's really quite feasible to do, in any side that does it, it's only going to be a matter of weeks before the other side has that same capability. So it's very difficult to stay ahead of the game in some of these ways. Ukraine is testing domestically produced drones capable of automatically targeting Shahed drones, said the Ukrainian military expert Ivan Stupak. In recent months, Russia has intensified its drone attacks on Ukraine, utilizing various types of drones, including Iranian-made Shaheds, and that is definitely an issue. The Shahed manufacturing and procurement has gone through the roof, I would say. I don't know if these are the drones I showed the other day. I don't know if they have a picture of them. They were these new type of drone. So let's read this. Ukraine is testing its drones that have the capability to target Shaheds, even if they fly at speeds exceeding 150 kilometers an hour, up to 200, using artificial intelligence. We hope this will mean that the number of Russian drones, which reached over 2,000 over Ukraine in just October, won't increase significantly, and we will have a greater capacity to shoot them down. Due to the destruction of depots by the Armed Forces of Ukraine, Special Operations Force, Security Service and the main intelligence directorate, large-scale Russian missile strikes have been delayed. It's not that the Russians don't have missiles, but they have to move them from other depots and disperse them to prevent strikes from Ukraine. That's interesting, because I've been wondering about missiles, about production rates of missiles. So that gives us a little bit of an indication. The Russians might also be waiting for colder weather to launch attacks, but it's likely that they have abandoned such plans. Interesting potential info on missile procurement, numbers, use, etc., etc. Okay, now Zelensky talking about drone manufacturing. Zelensky has held a Stavka meeting on defence with the chief of staff. Key points were boosting of air defences against increased Russian drone attacks, ramping up domestic production of weapons and tech, and securing 3 to 5 year contracts for Ukrainian drone manufacturers in order to ensure long-term supply, says Nell reports. Interesting there, and makes a lot of sense to me. Now, over 200 Russian drones were shot down by US-funded mobile fire teams since January, according to the US ambassador. US Ambassador Bridget Brink, ambassador to Ukraine, said yesterday that the US State Department has funded 800 mobile fire teams in Ukraine, which have shot down over 200 Russian drones since January 2024. I reckon that's going to be a mixture of Avengers, like the Humvees with Stinger missiles on top. You got machine guns on the back of SUVs. I know that Czechia provided a bunch of Toyotas. I'm sure it's Czechia. We see a number of different sort of ways of doing this, and you've obviously got the Gepards. Germany's mainly behind them, but the mobile fire teams, I assume, is going to be sort of Humvees and SUVs with machine guns mainly there, and US supplying 800 or funding 800 of those teams. That's incredible. So Russian drone development is seriously hampered by lack of support from commanders in the state, in contrast to a much more open and supportive approach taken by the Ukrainians, according to a Russian drone developer. This says a Chris wiki thread. We've heard this many times before. This is nothing new, but let's go over it again. Right, the Project Archangel Telegram channel, which represents volunteer Russian drone developers, has posted a critical commentary contrasting the Russian and Ukrainian approaches towards drone development. The author calls for urgent changes to the Russian side. He highlights 3 key issues: commanders and their approach promising the effective products. Commanders and their approach. 2, promising effective products. 3, training for promising and effective products. Oh, that's promising and effective. So promising and effective. So ones that have the potential to do well and ones that are doing well. So if they are not resolved, Russia will have to rely instead on massed assaults with soldiers, aviation and artillery. Not the best option for us. For commanders, there are 2 approaches. 1, young officers lead, rely on the war of technical products, invest in technological innovations. Any initiative is correctly perceived, supported and welcomed in every possible way. Each fighter is used with an assessment of his abilities and skills. In my humble opinion, this is a promising and correct approach. 2, commanders from the Napoleonic era with vast experience and great merits lead. Everyone knows each other from their joint studies since the time of Khrushchev. They recently mastered the push-button telephone. Progressive initiatives of young officers are categorically not welcomed. Any initiative is persecuted and punished. What if this upstart starts showing results and the grandchildren have a mortgage and they need to somehow sit in the chair? So we are witnessing a mini-staff confrontation between the young, effective and energetic and the great and honoured. So what to do? At the state level, the author contrasts the proactive Ukrainian approach with the bureaucratic and unresponsive Russian approach. So, quote, Ukraine in 2023, Ukraine is launching the so-called Brave One platform, a system of accepting applications for technology grants, supported by the series of conferences in which any drone development team in the world can participate, and not just participate, but also receive funding if the development deserves to be implemented in series. And in 2024, in October, conferences will begin in Kyiv, and now not only developers but also investors in drone production will participate there. In other words, he's moaning about, and rightly so, the Ukrainian ability to harness the free market and the international investment community in helping fund and create drones that will be effective, using feedback from the front lines for the Ukrainian armed forces, in a way that Russia, with their unresponsive old school kind of Soviet era hierarchies, are unable to do. In October, Fedorov reported on preliminary results of the first year of work, $8 million in funding for developments, and more than 200 funding-worthy applications for technical innovations are registered in the Brave One system every month. Russia, on the other hand, I don't know how things are going for others, but I'll tell you how it is for us. Since 2022, we have more than a dozen highly sought-after developments in the drone field. Not a single development has been missed. All are in series and in high demand. But even despite the epic debut of the Kuznetchik, likely a fiber optic FPV drones, our customers are still only volunteers and the fighters themselves. The volumes, as you understand, cannot be large. There is no need to talk about supporting new developments or helping to expand production. As a result, it turns out that Ukraine supports and finances developers and Russia ignores them. Fascinating stuff there. And probably now worth going on to this. It's like there's an order to this. Russian propagandist Margarita Simonyan asks all Russians to donate money to the Russian army. This is significant. Now, yes, Ukraine has been doing this. We've been fundraising for Ukraine, right? Is what we're doing because we understand there's a moral component and there's a desperate need. Everyone accepts that Ukraine is in desperate need for stuff, right? This is Margarita Simonyan, one of the biggest propagandists, saying, basically implying that Russia is desperate for money for the Russian army. She is asking all Russians to donate. Quote, every person who has such an opportunity should actively participate in helping the front. It's getting harder for Russia to finance its war economy, says Anton Gerashenko. Questions him. I mean, absolutely. So her words here are, it seems to me that every person who has such an opportunity should actively participate in helping the front. For example, I know a pensioner who sends 1,000 rubles out of a small pension every month. I mean, whether she actually knows that or not, I don't know. I'm not calling on every pensioner to do this, but I would like to once again appeal to wealthy people. It is your unconditional duty. It should be an internal law. It is the law to help now while the fighting is going on, to help peaceful people, to help the front, the units. She says, if you don't know how, ask us. We have a lot of verified requests from specific units where everything is written down. So she's appealing to a poor old babushka sitting in a cold flat, asking them to give $1,000 of their pension, while Margarita Simonyan, sitting on the back of like millions of spondoolies, undoubtedly does a square root of naff all. So she says, we'll, if you don't know how, just ask us. We've got a lot of verified people, blah, 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 what to buy, what drones, what anti-drone guns, and much, much more. I think that's a real reflection of how troubling the situation is for Russia. Now, Russia is using about 10 times as many Shahids as last autumn, says Zelensky after that meeting we talked about earlier. And although we heard what he's going to do from that meeting, it is a development of new solutions to fight against guided bombs, absolutely, reinforcement of mobile fire groups, shells, weapons, equipment, electronic warfare, equipment, drones, contracting results for the current year and planning for the next year, 3 to 5 years as well, strengthening the air defence in the regions that need it most. But yeah, Shahids, 10 times as many. I think the one of the biggest successes of the Russians has been their Shahid production and not so much use, but the numbers that they're using. Because what's actually happened is they are struggling for those Shahids to be effective. So what they are doing, though, is producing enough to probably get a sense of the air defences around Ukraine. But they are losing an awful lot of those Shahid drones. They are not as effective as they once were. So on the one hand, brilliant, we're using 100, but oh dear, Ukraine are now at such a point where they are intercepting sort of 95 to 100% of the drones that we send, even if we do send loads. But of course, if we were only sending 20, then only one would get through. We're sending 100, 5 are getting through. So that it still has an effect. That they are able to produce and procure that many drones does mean that they are having more success than they otherwise would have had. Right, Shashank Joshi of The Economist says, piece below has caused quite a stir. Worth reading the analysis before opining on it, though. Iran's demonstrable accuracy in 2020 is not proof of accuracy over a much longer range in very different circumstances. The author notes that if Iran avoided overshoots, accuracy would jump. Okay, so what is the claim here? So evidence from Israel suggests that Iranian missiles, and we mention this because Iran is supposedly giving, or was going to supposedly be giving, ballistic missiles, kind of short to medium range ballistic missiles to Russia. However, now that they're so heavily involved in the conflict with Israel quite directly, I don't know if that's still going to happen. There were claims that they had sent 400 to Russia. We haven't heard too much about that. We know that they've got KN-23s Russia from North Korea, and those aren't, I think, particularly reliable either. Well, these evidence from Israel suggests that Iranian missiles are less accurate than we thought. Quote, Iranian missiles likely have a CEP, so circle error probable is that 50% of the time they land within within an area of whatever the CEP is. So it's a circle error probable. But it means 50% of the time, actually, they can land outside that. It's quite an easy to kind of easy to miss metric, isn't it? I don't know how best to describe that. 50%, isn't like, although something like a HIMARS will be far more accurate far more often. But with these Iranian missiles, the circle error probable isn't like 5 meters or 10 meters away from its target, like a radius of 5 to 10 meters. This is 8 to 900 meters, potentially as good as 500 meters if you make a series of extremely favorable assumptions for Iran. So at the best, they're 500 meters CEP, but generally 8 to 900 meters. That's terrible. Like if you're trying to hit something in a city which is a genuine military target, the chances are that's going to be blowing up somewhere like 900 meters away or within that distance from that target. So that's going to be civilian infrastructure. My goodness, that is poor. Right, geopolitical news now. So as I mentioned in my update last night, breaking news update, Maya Sandu, the president of Moldova, Republic of Moldova, has been re-elected for her second stint. She's a pro-EU leader and she's beaten the pro-Russian leader. She announced her victory in a presidential election in Moldova, said that Moldova had suffered an unprecedented attack in the elections. There were dirty money, vote buying, interference by criminal groups in the electoral process, but the people have united. 99.64% of the votes have been processed. I think she's won by about 56% to 44% thereabouts. Last time I looked, it's 55.9%. For her. So that's actually in the end pretty good. It was looking a bit dodgy at the beginning, but like I warned you, there were rural areas that were submitting their votes first, and so they skewed towards Stanoglu, the pro-Russian candidate, because the kind of right-wing nationalistic viewpoints are much more likely to exist in rural areas than urban areas, and the larger urban areas with more votes are counted. They're slower to count, right? And they come in later. So you get these big batches that come in, and you can go from looking like the right wing was going to win to actually moving over to the pro-EU candidate. Like we see, as I've said before, in, say, the US elections as well. Similar sort of thing happens there. Now, Zelensky's congratulated Moldova's Sandu on her re-election. Quote, "Congratulations to Maya Sandu on winning the presidential election in Moldova." Obviously, he has more words than that. Ukraine supports a European choice of the Moldovan people and stands ready to work together to strengthen our partnership. That's really important for Zelensky that she gets in. Really important for the EU in general and for democracy. Now, it's interesting. When pro-Russians won in Georgia, like Georgian Dream, stacked the election in their favour, it took Orban 0.1 seconds to congratulate them. And of course, he's the first person to visit and had that press conference and, gave him a big pat on the back. A few hours later, he was on a plane bound for Georgia to congratulate them in person. Let's see how long it takes for him now to congratulate Maya Sandu on defeating the pro-Russian candidate. Ooh, tumbleweed. Not a lot to be heard, not a lot to be seen. Now, I found this interesting. This is a Moldovan court expert saying that the win of Sandu suggests that the United States of America should learn from Moldova. This is a kick in the teeth for pro-Trumpists out there. I know some of you still be watching. This is what a court expert in Moldova said. This is how to fight against Russian influence, and then Trump will definitely not win. The prevailing idea there is that Russia are interfering in the American election, and if you want to see how to beat Russia, then look to Moldova, and and then Trump won't win. If you know how to beat Russia, then Trump won't win the election. That is a pretty interesting thing to say. I don't disagree, by the way. A German Foreign Minister, Annalena Baerbock, from the Green Party, actually, she's doing a really good job for Germany in that coalition government. She's arrived in Kiev again, so she's there. Good stuff. CNN have reported that Putin is unlikely to negotiate regardless of the US election outcome. So some people saying, well, Trump himself saying he'll get it sorted in a day. There are claims from Dmitry Medvedev said that's not going to happen. Most Russian analysts are saying there's no chance of that. Russia are not interested in a quick deal, that certainly one that doesn't completely and utterly benefit them. And of course, that won't happen because Zelensky won't allow for that to happen, because his own people would not sanction such an agreement. And this is compromise. Compromise is that both people are going to be unhappy. And actually, if both people are going to be unhappy, you're more likely to see Zelensky agree to that than Putin. Putin won't, is just very unlikely to do that. So experts believe Putin will refuse peace talks with the Ukraine, regardless of a Harris or Trump presidency, as Moscow plans to maintain offensives despite heavy losses. So if you're one of these people that wants to support Trump because you think he genuinely will cause peace to come about sooner, then you might want to go and have a word to actual Russian analysts here. Now, I spent some time talking about the EU and Brexit yesterday, and I was talking about how the EU has helped Ukraine an awful lot, and that their aid wasn't, quotes, pathetic, and also that there is an issue with those who think the EU is crap because it doesn't allow countries to have sovereignty, but also complain that Viktor Orban exercises his sovereignty when he does what he wants his country to do, or Hungary does what it wants to do, although that's slightly controversial. In other words, you can't have it both ways there. Like either you do have sovereignty or you don't. So we, as the UK, did have more sovereignty. We always complained that, hey, how come there are these rules, and France seemed to be doing this and Germany seemed to be doing that, and we had this perception that the EU was far more constrictive than it actually was. And you can see from how Orban is making decisions that are really problematic for the EU and go against the grain. And it's not like, it's some constrictive kind of slave federation whereby you can only do what the EU says. Now, the guy that said that original comment that I responded to says, thank you for discussing my comment about the EU. This is really useful, this dialogue, because it gives us a greater understanding, gives you guys a great understanding of what's going on in the EU and how votes take place. So that's where I'm going with this. It says, thank you for discussing my comment about the EU and how I myself am happy not to be in the same club as Fico or Orban. You say the EU's response to the Ukraine situation has not been pathetic, but also acknowledge that the EU's rules render it impotent to deal with rogue members. At the moment, it struggles to, yes. I wouldn't say it's impotent, but it does find it difficult, e.g. Slovakia and Hungary. Exactly. So if we remove my admittedly subjective use of the word pathetic, that leaves us with the consensus that the EU is dysfunctional. No, it has functioned really well, and it has empirically got a load of funding, and that's what I talked about yesterday. It hasn't stopped, like Fico and Orban haven't stopped stuff going to Ukraine. A load of stuff has gone to Ukraine that wouldn't have gone to Ukraine. My argument is it wouldn't have gone to Ukraine had you had 27 individual states. There's no way Portugal and Spain and Slovenia and all these countries would have paid the amount they have through the EU funding to Ukraine had it not been for the EU. Had the EU not existed, that funding wouldn't have gone to Ukraine. That is the importance of the EU. And I think people need to remember that. People need to understand that. What the EU has done is act unilaterally on behalf of Ukraine, or unilaterally is probably the wrong word, acted on behalf of the Ukraine and kind of not cajoled, but kind of got agreement amongst all their member states that money is going to be spent by them, by their EU budgets on Ukraine. And that never would have happened from 27 individual unilateral decisions. Just wouldn't have happened. End of. So I still disagree with this idea that the EU is pathetic or impotent. It has issues, and we'll talk about those issues in a second. So I don't think it's dysfunctional. I think there are challenges, which is hardly surprising considering 27 disparate histories, cultures and economies are rapidly being stirred into one saucepan. Whose daft idea was that? It's a great idea, because had you not had that, the support for Ukraine, for example, wouldn't have been so good. Had you not had that, the EU wouldn't have been the incredibly important trade bloc that it is today. So I massively disagree with this, but thank you for your comment. But you are just empirically wrong. Do you think there would have been peace in Europe for 70 years? It's the EU that is, talking in Europe in those European member states. Like there's peace in geographical Europe, there's war in geographical Europe because of Ukraine. That's precisely why the EU is so desperate to sort that out. Now, granted, he says the EU government is perhaps no more dysfunctional than is the UK government, given that we already have a dysfunctional governmental system in the UK. Why compound our problems by placing ourselves under yet another tier of governmental dysfunctionality? I would just disagree with that. I think the benefits outweigh the challenges, but we won't get into that. So let's get on to the kind of voting thing. So granted, the EU member states have given Ukraine a degree of assistance. It's not a degree of assistance. They've given them a freaking loads of assistance and more than the US. Like there's more than any other entity in the world. And thus the universe. Right? So it's not just a degree of assistance. Without the EU, Ukraine would be screwed, or there'd be, because I think you've got the US and you've got the EU. Those two things. Like the UK, we are helping. But had we been doing that on our own, I think Ukraine would be in a lot of trouble. So there's no doubt the EU is not just. This is really understating the assistance here. But the individual member states could or might have helped anyway. Just no way to that extent. There's no way you would have got that unity going on. There's absolutely no way. As, for example, have done Norway, Canada, Australia and Japan. They've done that precisely because of the G7 and the EU and obviously US and UK putting pressure on them, right? That happens because they're working together. This is important of alliances. The alliance of the G7, the alliance of the EU, the alliance of NATO. Without alliances, everyone would be like, well, you get the free rider effect. Which is, I really want them supported. Go and look up the free rider effect. I really want them supported, but actually, someone else can do that. You have a donut jar, I can't think of the MS brain, can't think of the word, but it's optional to pay for I don't know, you got donuts on the counter, and if you want, it's a voluntary payment of I don't know, £1, right? And you're looking around, well, everyone else is paying £1. I'm just going to have a donut, thank you. And what happens if you don't force people to do stuff? You get the free rider phenomenon where just people just get away with being a bit dodgy and a bit cheapskate. And that's what happens. And if you hadn't had the EU working to enforce like a moral and political support of Ukraine, you would have just had nations free riding, which you were arguably getting anyway. And if it wasn't for the EU, they would be giving no support or very little support indeed. So just again, massively disagree with this. Your assertion that the EU member states wouldn't have helped Ukraine to the same extent without pressure from Brussels is not provable. No, it's not provable, but I think your idea that they would have done is also not provable. And I think I'm more justified in using things like the lack of bilateral assistance from many of those countries, and the vast majority of what they have given is EU enforced. And so I think I've got the data to support that, and I've got theorising like the free rider phenomenon. So come at me, but your argument can be used directly against yourself. So the burden of proof is I think equally on both of us here, because we're both saying they can or they can't, and I think I've got more justification. The suggestion that the member countries only respond to prompting from the EU is interesting, suggestive of perhaps a lack of independence or initiative, or even a lack of sovereignty. No, it's just a lack. The further away you get, I mean, the UK is a different one because of our position in the Cold War. Litvinenko and Skripal, because you can say, well, look at the UK, we have given a load, but that's because we are a very strong military force and we're an incredibly important part of NATO, and we have a relationship with Russia which is very strained, and so we are involved in a way that those neighbouring countries like the Nordic states and the Baltic states are as well. I think, but in a way that Portugal isn't, right? And Spain isn't. Those two countries are not doing enough, in my opinion. However, they're doing comparable amounts to the UK because of their EU obligations. And that's kind of my point. So regardless of whether or not the UK is or was affiliated to the EU, I personally am not glad to be associated in any direct way with the moral bankruptcy of Viktor Orban and Robert Fico. Similarly, I would not wish to join a club that would welcome Iran or North Korea as members, both of which arguably are currently demonstrating their sovereignty, are they not, by sponsoring worldwide misery. Should they be applauded? Moreover, according to some trusted commentators, although the EU gives to Ukraine with one hand, it takes back by the way of buying Russian hydrocarbons and by trading with Russia via third-party countries. That's not the EU, that's the individual states. And this is a problem. I pulled Francis Durney from the Ukraine the Latest podcast from the Daily Telegraph up on this at the beginning of the war, that he smashed together the EU and its member states when it's convenient for him to have a go at the EU, but separates them when it's not. And he is saying, the EU is not doing enough. And he was talking about France and Germany individually. And he said, the EU's not doing enough. Look at what France isn't doing. And look at what Germany isn't doing. And then he said, but look at what Poland's doing. And look at what, and at the time, Slovakia and these other nations. And he said, hang on. So these nations who are all also part of the EU are doing loads to help Ukraine. But these nations that are also part of the EU aren't doing stuff to help Ukraine. But when they don't do it, it's the EU's fault. But when they do it, it's not the EU's fault. And that's double standards. And I pulled him up on that. I wrote an article and I sent it out to Francis Stoney and said, you are being unfair here, because whenever European nations individually do bad things, it's the EU's fault. And when European nations individually do good things, it's because they have sovereignty and they're wonderful independent countries of the EU, which they're part of the EU, but they're doing it despite the EU. And that is what your man here is doing. This is, I would say, that's not an acceptable way to argue. So, it's saying that they're buying hydrocarbons and that's the EU's fault they're doing that, rather than it being like Spain's fault or Belgium's fault individually. And it's the idea that, it's convenient that they have sovereignty sometimes, because you can just forget they have that sovereignty and say that's the EU doing that. And then when they don't have sovereignty, then you can say they don't have sovereignty because of the EU. It's like having your cake and eat it. It's a real problematic approach to criticising the EU, and I absolutely disagree. So I'm not entirely convinced that pathetic is an inappropriate adjective. It deeply is. NATO's response has also been inadequate. Arguably, yes. Perhaps even pathetic, don't know, as demonstrated by the fact that Kremlin's project to obliterate the Ukrainian nation continues unabated. And if the EU members hadn't been so keen to trade with Russia during the last 30 years or more, Schroeder and Merkel, etc., refers, then perhaps the Kremlin would not have been able to afford to launch its 3-day SMO in the first place. Now, this is highly controversial arguing, right? It's really convenient to, and thank you for the comment, but honestly, there's an awful lot wrong with this Grassroots 2024. Now, this is, and we see this all the time, which is criticizing countries for buying cheap hydrocarbons from Russia. That's really easy to do when you have your own pool of hydrocarbons. So we have the North Sea oil reserves, and Norway does as well. And so we go, oh my God, look at you guys buying cheap hydrocarbons from Russia. Yeah, we'd never do that because we've got our own reserves. If we didn't have our own reserves, what do you think we'd be doing? Buying cheap hydrocarbons from Russia. Now, I can't prove that, but it's I think really simplistic to criticize other nations when they're in a completely different situation than yourself. And if you were given the option, I mean, think about your own household. Do you move energy company to get the cheapest energy you can on a yearly basis? Most people are price driven, and you will switch from one energy company to the other to whoever gives you the cheapest energy. You do that. You do that. I'm slightly different. When there was People's Energy previously, I paid a little bit more because I wanted my energy to be actually have a moral dimension, because I'm an ethical consumer. That went out of business due to energy crisis, etc. But I joined the People's Energy Company. I'm now with a company called Octopus, which is good for renewables, right? And actually it's a really good price as well, but it is, most people are price driven. We know this from data. And so if most people are price driven, you can bet your bottom dollar that most countries are going to be somewhat price driven as well. So if you're in charge of a budget and taxpayers wanting to pay tax, if you're like, or if you're the oil company, it's not even the state often, it's like the oil companies or the energy distribution companies that are getting in their hydrocarbons from the cheapest place they can get them, and then the consumers go, thank you very much, we've got cheap energy. Brilliant. Like, as a nation, if you can get cheap energy, you'll have cheap energy rather than expensive energy, right? All things remaining equal. So yes, there's going to be international geopolitical strategizing to overlay that equation. But the point that, the EU's rubbish because they've been relying on cheap Russian hydrocarbons for 30 years is I think just a cheap shot because we're lucky enough to have our own deposits. Anyway, and if EU members hadn't been anyway, right, I'm going to use that to just very quickly talk about, okay, but there is a problem in the EU, and the problem is the unanimity of voting. So there has been this push recently, here's a German piece, more EU decisions by qualified majority voting, but how? So there are legal and political options for extending qualified majority voting. There are in the debate on how to strengthen European Union's capacity to act, calls for an extension of qualified majority voting, QMV, are growing louder. The Council of the EU is currently discussing using the so-called passerelle clauses in the Treaty of the European Union, TEU. With these clauses, more decisions by QMV could be introduced without a major treaty change or a convention. Because if you want to change the rules and then you're going to say Hungary saying, well, we don't want you to change the rules because actually we can put a veto in place, then you can change it without having to have a convention or a treaty change. However, abolishing national vetoes in this way would first require unanimity as well. So, okay, I go back on that. So Hungary might have to vote for the change of the rules. There might have to be unanimous vote on the change of the rules so that unanimity isn't a necessity for passing declarations and rules and whatnot. So on and so forth. Such unanimity is currently not in sight as resistance is prevailing in smaller and medium-sized member states. In other words, Hungary, etc., etc. So here we have Euronews saying 9 EU countries join forces to reform voting rules on foreign policy and dent veto power. Under current rules, all foreign policy decisions in the EU require the unanimous approval of 27 member states, but a group of 9 of them have set out to change this. That is, so the newly formed group of friends of qualified majority voting consists of Belgium, Finland, France, Germany, Italy, Luxembourg, and Netherlands, and Slovenia and Spain, and is open to other countries to join if they wish as well. Now, what is qualified majority voting? So QMV is a mechanism used within the European Council and the Council of the EU to take decisions without the need for unanimity, but which go beyond a simple majority of members. So normally you go like 51%, or just over 50.1%, and you can pass that rule. Many congressional or parliamentary setups around the world will have super majorities for certain things. If we want to do that, then actually you need 2/3. This is kind of similar to that. So there are 2 forms of qualified majority, standard and reinforced. For the former, so the standard qualified majority vote, decisions are adopted if at least 55% of member states, meaning 15 out of 27, but they're also representing at least 65% of the EU population approve. So it's actually, the way I understand that, it's you couldn't have 55% of member states if they didn't represent also 65% of the EU population. So a bunch of the smaller states wanting to do things, unless you had like Germany or Italy or France or Spain also involved in that to some degree, then it ain't going to happen. So it's an interesting way of doing it. For the latter, which is reinforced majority vote, at least 72% of member states must approve, representing the same proportion of the EU population. So one is still 65% of the EU population, but 72% of the states. And that means that you can get things passed. So that is what is entailed in QMV. And that would be preferable to supporting Ukraine, because countries like Hungary couldn't put a veto in and stop things from happening. Things are still happening. There's still support for Ukraine, massive support for Ukraine from the EU. So it's not like Hungary has stopped everything. Go and look at the Kiel Institute tracker for support from the EU to Ukraine. It's been massive, right? So I do thank you for your comment, and I'm not having a go at you, like I'm having a go at your ideas. Thank you. I really do appreciate the time spent on putting this comment together, and it does make for interesting debate. And hopefully I haven't wasted time in having this debate, because I think this is super important for our understanding of how the EU works or doesn't work, and what might need to happen, but also whether criticisms are unfair or not. Finally, Russian Navy is in training doing an exercise with Indonesia. This is a worry, because you are looking at global south or nations outside of the West, etc., getting pally with Russia. Indonesia is a massive country, the highest Muslim population in the world. It is a big player in the world, and it's a worry that Russia are doing exercises with Indonesia. That's enough from me. Take care, guys. Speak to you soon.